March 24th, 2026, 6:15 a.m., Napa Valley, California. The fog had not yet lifted from the vineyards along Silverado Trail when a convoy of 17 unmarked federal vehicles turned off the highway and rolled in radio silence toward the iron gates of a 42-acre estate owned by Dr. Margaret Holdsworth. Inside the lead Suburban, FBI San Francisco Special Agent Priya Venkatesh checked her watch for the third time in 90 seconds. Beside her, HHS-OIG Special Agent Marcus Olawole tightened the Velcro on his raid vest and exhaled the long, slow breath of a man who had been waiting 14 months for this exact minute. Behind them, 4 more vehicles carried evidence response technicians, 2 forensic accountants from the Department of Justice National Security Division, and a sealed federal warrant authorizing the search and seizure of records, devices, and any item bearing the corporate seal of Pacific Crest Healthcare Network. At 6:14 a.m., a Cyber Division technical agent parked in a van 2 miles down the road quietly severed the estate's fiber uplink. At 6:15 a.m. exactly, the breaching team blew the secondary service gate with a calibrated charge that sounded, from inside the main house, like a single sharp cough. 41 seconds later, agents were in the foyer. 11 seconds after that, they were inside the second-floor study where Dr. Margaret Holdsworth, 62 years old, Harvard MBA, 22-year chief executive of the largest non-profit hospital network on the United States West Coast, was sitting at her desk in a cream silk robe, holding a phone that no longer had service, staring at the agents as if she had been expecting them every morning for the last 7 years. She did not stand. She did not speak. She placed the phone face down on a leather blotter, folded her hands in her lap, and said, very quietly, the only 2 words she would say for the next 9 hours, "My attorney." Across 3 states, at that same minute, 14 Pacific Crest administrative facilities were entering federal custody. In Palo Alto and Portland and Seattle, in Sacramento and Eugene and Tacoma, server rooms went dark, badge readers stopped responding, and over 800 employees were instructed by federal agents to step away from their workstations and keep their hands visible. By 7 a.m., the largest healthcare data theft in American history was no longer a secret. Retention_checkpoint 030 hook resolution tease. Over the next 20 minutes, you are going to hear how one Mayo Clinic graduate student noticed a statistical impossibility buried inside a Chinese pharmaceutical patent, how that single observation unraveled a 7-year, $2.1 billion conspiracy involving 38 million American patients, and how federal investigators built a case so airtight that the woman at the center of it offered no defense at all. This is Operation Jade Conduit, and it begins 18 months before the raid in a fluorescent lit basement office in Rochester, Minnesota. ACT-1 Discovery. Erin Bell Quaid was 29 years old, 3 years into a doctoral program in biomedical informatics at the Mayo Clinic, and by every measure that mattered to his advisor, badly behind on his dissertation. His committee had given him a 2-month deadline to produce a draft of his second chapter, a meta-analysis of patent literature surrounding orphan disease drug development. Erin had spent most of November and December reading through patent filings submitted to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and to its Chinese counterpart, the CNIPA, looking for patterns in how generic manufacturers cited clinical cohort data. It was the kind of work that put most people to sleep. Erin found it strangely calming. He had a habit, inherited from his mother, who had been an actuary, of running side calculations on anything that looked too neat. On January 18th, 2025, at roughly 2 in the morning, Erin was working through a stack of 17 patent filings submitted by Hangzhou Lixia Biologic, a mid-sized Chinese pharmaceutical conglomerate that had, in the previous 4 years, brought to market a surprising number of generic competitors to American-branded drugs. The filings cited patient cohort statistics, ethnicity breakdowns, age distributions, BMI medians, comorbidity rates, longitudinal treatment response curves. The cohorts were always described as anonymized aggregate populations from licensed research partners. Erin noticed something. The ethnic composition of the cohort, in a Hangzhou Lizhou filing for a generic version of a multiple sclerosis drug matched to within 0.3% across 9 demographic dimensions the publicly reported patient demographics of a specific American hospital network. He thought it was a coincidence. He moved on. 6 hours later, near dawn, he found the same statistical fingerprint in a second Hangzhou Lizhou filing, this one for a generic oncology compound, then a third, then a fifth. By the end of that week, Aaron had cross-referenced 41 Hangzhou Lizhou patent filings against the publicly reported demographic profiles of the 11 largest non-profit hospital networks in the United States. 40 of those 41 filings matched the patient demographics of one network, and one network only, Pacific Crest Healthcare Network, headquartered in Burlingame, California, operating 14 hospitals across California, Oregon, and Washington, serving approximately 4 million unique patients annually, with a longitudinal patient record retention horizon of 22 years. The probability that a Chinese generic drug manufacturer would, by random sampling of global patient populations, repeatedly select cohorts whose demographic, ethnic, and treatment response distributions exactly matched a single American hospital chain was, by Aaron's own conservative calculation, roughly 1 in 2.4 times 10 to the negative 37th power. In layman's terms, it was not possible. Something was being transferred. He spent another 2 weeks running every sanity check he could think of. He varied his comparison populations. He tested for confounders. He ran the analysis past a friend in the biostatistics department, framed as a hypothetical. The friend looked at the numbers for 10 minutes and said, "Aaron, somebody is selling that data." Aaron Belquay did not call the police. He did not call the FBI. He did what most 29-year-old graduate students would do in 2025. He drafted a 14-page memo, formatted it like a research note, and emailed it to 3 people: his dissertation advisor, the chief informatics officer at Mayo Clinic, and an old college roommate who worked as a federal prosecutor in the Northern District of California. The roommate forwarded it that same afternoon to a contact she had at FBI San Francisco. The contact forwarded it within 2 hours to the healthcare fraud unit. By Tuesday morning of the following week, the memo was sitting on the desk of Special Agent Priya Venkatesh, who read it 3 times, walked into her supervisor's office, closed the door, and said, "I think we have something, ACT2, Spioswary map." The first month of the investigation was a quiet one. Venkatesh did not want a single subpoena issued, a single witness interviewed, or a single piece of paper filed at the courthouse that might find its way back to Pacific Crest. She brought in Marcus Olawole from HHS Office of Inspector General because data theft from a federally regulated healthcare institution was statutorily their jurisdiction, and because Marcus had spent 11 years building cases against hospital executives and had a finely tuned instinct for how those executives moved money. They worked out of a windowless conference room on the 4th floor of the federal building in San Francisco, with the door locked and the case file kept on a single air-gapped laptop that lived in a safe at night. What they were looking at, on paper, looked benign. Pacific Crest had, for nearly a decade, operated a research partnership program. It licensed de-identified aggregate patient data to academic institutions, biotech startups, and what its annual reports described as international research collaborators. The program brought in approximately $300 million a year in licensing revenue, which Pacific Crest's annual reports characterized as a small but meaningful contribution to its non-profit mission. The structure was, on its face, legal. EIAPA permits the licensing of de-identified data under specific conditions. The data Pacific Crest licensed was, according to its own compliance certifications, fully de-identified per HHS safe harbor methodology. It was not. What Aaron Belquade had observed in the patent filings was that the cohorts were de-identified in name only. The records included, for each of 38 million unique patients across 22 years, full longitudinal treatment histories, genetic markers from sequencing performed during diagnostic workups, Drug response curves measured across multiple medications and dosing regimens, comorbidity timelines, lifestyle indicators pulled from intake forms, and family medical histories transcribed from physician notes. Names had been stripped, social security numbers had been stripped, but the residual data was so dense, so longitudinal, and so granular that any patient in the dataset could be re-identified with greater than 97% confidence using only 3 external data points: zip code, date of birth, and a single prescription history. Pacific Crest's General Counsel had certified, year after year, that the data met the federal day identification standard. The certifications were, the investigators concluded after 3 weeks of analysis, knowingly false. Marcus Olawole spent the second month of the investigation following the money. The licensing revenue did not flow directly from Hangzhou Lija to Pacific Crest. It flowed through a Bermuda-registered holding company called Vanguard Atlantic Health Research, whose sole listed activity was the management of cross-border research partnerships. Vanguard Atlantic had been incorporated in 2018 by a Bermudian law firm that, conveniently, had been on retainer with Pacific Crest's outside counsel since 2011. The money trail was elegant in a way that only money trails designed by very expensive accountants ever are. Hangzhou Lija wired payments to Vanguard Atlantic, which booked them as research licensing fees. Vanguard Atlantic then forwarded a portion to Pacific Crest as International Research Partnership royalties, which Pacific Crest dutifully recognized on its non-profit tax filings. The remainder was substantial, flowed through 3 further offshore entities in the Caymans, the Channel Islands, and eventually into a series of personal trust accounts controlled by Margaret Holdsworth herself. Over 7 years, $2.1 billion moved through Vanguard Atlantic. $340 million of that, the investigators would eventually conclude, landed in Holdsworth's personal control. But the conspiracy was not just Holdsworth alone. By the end of month 3, Venkatesh and Olawole had identified 2 more central figures: Dr. Hua Chen, age 47, Pacific Crest's chief data officer, recruited from Stanford in 2017, with a PhD in computational biology and a salary on file that did not begin to explain the $4 million home he had purchased in cash in Atherton in 2022, and Dr. Park Ji-hoo, age 43, Pacific Crest's director of informatics infrastructure, who had personally architected the data extraction pipelines that delivered the patient records to an SFTP server hosted in Hong Kong on the 3rd Friday of every month. Chen and Park were the technical engine of the conspiracy. Holdsworth was its strategic and financial center. Together, the 3 of them had moved more sensitive medical information out of the United States than any private actor in the history of the country. ACT-3, Investigative Wall. The 4th month of the investigation was the hardest. Venkatesh and Olawole had a theory, a paper trail, and a graduate student's statistical analysis. They did not have what federal prosecutors in the Northern District of California needed to indict a Harvard MBA who employed 22,000 people and sat on the boards of 3 major universities. They needed the actual data transfers. They needed to demonstrate, in a way that would survive a defense team paid $1,800 an hour, that Pacific Crest had knowingly transferred re-identifiable patient records to a foreign pharmaceutical company in violation of HIPAA, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and the Economic Espionage Act of 1996. OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, came into the case in month 5. Hangzhou Lija Biologic was not itself a sanctioned entity, but 2 of its 3 largest equity holders were investment vehicles linked to individuals on OFAC's specially designated nationals list. Once OFAC certified that link, every dollar that had flowed from Hangzhou Lija to Vanguard Atlantic became, under federal law, a transaction with a sanctioned party, and every executive at Pacific Crest who had knowingly participated in or facilitated that transaction had committed a separate federal felony carrying 20 years per count. Suddenly, the case was not a healthcare fraud case, it was a national security case that changed everything. The Department of Justice National Security Division assigned 2 prosecutors, The FBI Cyber Division provided a 6-person technical team with the authority to image foreign servers remotely under sealed warrants. By the start of month 9, federal investigators had identified 4 physical servers operated by Hangzhou Lijia and its technical contractors across Hong Kong and Taipei. By month 11, they had quietly imaged all 4. The images contained, among many other things, a complete archive of every transfer Pacific Crest had ever made to Hangzhou Lijia, 84 monthly drops over 7 years, totaling 640 terabytes of patient data, every single transfer logged, time-stamped, and digitally signed by credentials that traced unambiguously back to Dr. Park Ji-hoo. ACT-4 Breakthrough Preview. But first, an investigative wall is only as good as the people who can read it. At the end of month 12, the wall in that windowless conference room had grown to 42 linear feet. Photographs, bank wires, corporate filings, a flowchart of Vanguard Atlantic's 7 shell companies, a printout of an email chain in which Holdsworth, using a personal Proton Mail account, had instructed Park to accelerate the cadence of the monthly transfers because, in her own words, "Our international partners are eager for the Q4 cohort." That email, recovered from a server image, was the moment the case became prosecutable. It was also the moment Venkatesh allowed herself, for the first time in a year, to believe that the woman in Napa Valley was going to be in handcuffs. Breakthrough. The decisive evidence came not from servers in Hong Kong but from a single hard drive in a guest house in Atherton. Dr. Hua Chen, the chief data officer, had a personal habit of backing up his work laptop every weekend to an external drive he kept in his home office. He did this because, like many technically meticulous people, he did not trust corporate IT to preserve his work. The backup contained, among other things, a folder labeled VA#Z Archive, in which Chen had kept his own copies of every monthly transfer manifest, going back to 2019. Each manifest listed the exact number of patient records transferred. The categories of data included the SFTP destination and a per-transfer revenue projection that tied each shipment to an expected payment from Vanguard Atlantic. The investigators did not know about the drive until month 13. They found it because Hua Chen, who had been growing increasingly anxious throughout 2025, had begun consulting a divorce attorney. The attorney, fulfilling a state bar obligation, filed a routine notice in family court. The notice referenced certain financial accounts and professional documentation that Chen wished to characterize as his separate property. A paralegal at the firm, who had once interned at HHS-OIG, recognized the pattern, and although she did not violate her ethical obligations, she did, in an entirely unrelated conversation with a former mentor, mention that a Pacific Crest executive seems to be putting his house in order in a way that makes me think something is coming. That single sentence, passed up the chain, was enough for Olawole to expedite the surveillance authorization on Chen's residence. When the raid team entered the guest house on the morning of March 24th, the external drive was sitting on a shelf above Chen's desk, in plain view, next to a paperback copy of The Art of War. Chen was at the kitchen counter making coffee. He looked at the agents, looked at the drive, and said, "I want a lawyer, and I want to talk." He was the first of the 3 principals to cooperate. Within 72 hours, Chen had walked federal prosecutors through the entire technical architecture of the transfer pipeline, named 2 additional Pacific Crest employees who had played supporting roles, and identified a senior executive in Hangzhou Lijia's Strategic Intelligence Office who Chen alleged had personally negotiated the data licensing structure with Holdsworth in a series of meetings in Vancouver and Singapore between 2017 and 2019. If this reconstruction has held your attention so far, please take 1 second to tap the like button. It genuinely helps these long-form investigations reach the people who care about how American institutions are protected. Subscribe if you have not already. Now back to the raid. Act 4. The Raid. The decision to execute on March 24th had been made 11 days earlier in a conference room at Main Justice in Washington. In a meeting attended by senior officials from the FBI, HHS-OIG, OFAC, the National Security Division, and the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of California, the choice of date was not random. March 24th was a Tuesday, which minimized weekend evidence handling complications. It was 9 days before the close of Pacific Crest's fiscal quarter, which meant that incriminating financial records would still be on local servers rather than archived off-site. And it was, by chance, the third Tuesday of the month, which was when Holdsworth's calendar showed her working from her Napa Valley estate rather than the Burlingame headquarters. The operation was codenamed Jade Conduit, a reference both to the Chinese cultural significance of jade and to the metaphor that had emerged within the investigative team, that what Pacific Crest had built was a pipeline, a conduit, through which something precious had flowed in only one direction, eastward, for 7 years. At 5:30 a.m., 14 separate raid teams staged in parking lots across 3 states. At 6 a.m., the Cyber Division team began its remote imaging operation against the 4 Hong Kong and Taipei servers, designed to preserve evidence before any signal from the physical raids could prompt the Chinese side to wipe data. At 6:14 a.m., the fiber uplinks were severed at every Pacific Crest facility. At 6:15 a.m., every door opened simultaneously. Inside Pacific Crest headquarters in Burlingame, agents found 72 employees already at work. None resisted. Most appeared genuinely confused. The chief financial officer, who had been at the company for 19 years, asked an agent, with what observers later described as honest bewilderment, whether the visit was related to a recent Medicare audit. He was told that it was not, and he was asked to step into a conference room and wait. Inside the data center, 3 Cyber Division technicians began imaging every server in the facility, a process that would ultimately consume 11 days and produce 4.7 petabytes of evidence. Inside Holdsworth's corner office on the 14th floor, an evidence response technician opened the credenza behind her desk and found a stack of paper files, neatly labeled VA correspondence, that her assistant had never been authorized to touch. In Atherton, Hua Chen was taken into custody at 6:31 a.m. after a 16-minute interview in his own kitchen, during which he requested, and was granted, the opportunity to call his attorney from a kitchen phone while seated under federal supervision. In Mountain View, Park Ji-hoo was taken into custody at 6:42 a.m. after a brief encounter in his garage, where agents had intercepted him as he was attempting to leave for a flight to Seoul that had been booked. The investigation would later determine, on March 17th, Park's flight had been booked 1 day after Holdsworth received what would turn out to be the only direct warning the conspirators ever received, a vague text message from a Bermudian lawyer suggesting that increased regulatory interest in Vanguard Atlantic's structure might warrant a consultative posture. The text had been intercepted 2 weeks earlier under a sealed FISA-derived authorization. The investigators had let it through because they wanted to see what the 3 principals would do. What they did was tell investigators almost everything they needed to know. Park booked a flight. Chen consulted a divorce lawyer. Holdsworth, by contrast, did nothing. She told no one. She moved no money. She did not contact her attorney. She continued her schedule exactly as planned. Whether this reflected confidence, denial, or a kind of fatalism that investigators encountered in many long-running white-collar defendants, no one would ever be entirely sure. What it produced operationally was a raid in which none of the 3 principals had time to destroy evidence, and only one of them had time to attempt flight. Micro-final. By noon on March 24th, all 3 principals were in federal custody. By 4 p.m., 2 additional Pacific Crest employees, a senior accountant and a compliance director, had been arrested on the basis of evidence Chen had begun to provide. By the end of the week, federal prosecutors had filed a sealed indictment running to 271 counts, including conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, multiple violations of HIPAA's criminal provisions, violations of the Economic Espionage Act, violations of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and money laundering in furtherance of all of the foregoing. The combined maximum statutory exposure for Holdsworth alone exceeded 400 years. ACT 5 Aftermath. The civil consequences arrived almost immediately. Within 72 hours of the raid, the state of California, the state of Oregon, and the state of Washington jointly filed motions seeking the appointment of a federal monitor over Pacific Crest's clinical operations on the grounds that patient trust in the network had been irrevocably compromised and that the safe continuity of care for 4 million annual patients required immediate independent oversight. The federal court granted the motion within 8 days. Pacific Crest's board, which had been wholly unaware of the data licensing structure, terminated Holdsworth's employment in absentia within 48 hours of her arrest and announced an emergency search for an interim chief executive. Hangzhou Lija Biologic, for its part, issued a single press release in Mandarin denying any wrongdoing and characterizing the American allegations as a politically motivated attempt to suppress legitimate Chinese pharmaceutical innovation. Within 2 weeks, however, 3 of the 47 generic drug formulations that the company had brought to market using Pacific Crest data were under formal review by regulators in 12 countries. Within 4 weeks, the United States Trade Representative had opened a Section 301 investigation. Within 2 months, OFAC had designated 6 additional individuals associated with Hangzhou Lijia's strategic intelligence operations. The financial damage to American-branded drug manufacturers, which a Department of Commerce analysis estimated at $14 billion in lost revenue across 12 therapeutic categories over 7 years, would never be recovered. Erin Bell-Quaid, the Mayo Clinic graduate student whose late-night observation had set the entire investigation in motion, learned of the raid the way most people did, from a news alert on his phone while he was sitting in a Rochester coffee shop trying once again to finish his dissertation chapter. He read the alert twice, set his phone down, and ordered another coffee. He has never publicly commented on the case. His name does not appear in the indictment or in any of the press releases. Special Agent Venkatesh, when asked about the case in a single brief on-the-record interview 6 months later, described its origin only as the result of a vigilant observation by a private citizen with strong analytic training. Then she changed the subject. Margaret Holdsworth was denied bail at her detention hearing on March 26th. She entered a plea of not guilty at her arraignment on April 14th. As of the time of this reconstruction, her trial has not yet begun. The federal indictment, the image servers, the manifest archive, the bank records, and the cooperation of Doctors Chen and Park stand as the foundation of a prosecution that, federal officials have said, will define how the United States protects the medical privacy of its citizens for a generation. Operation Jade Conduit closed a pipeline that had carried, for 7 years, the most intimate information about 38 million Americans into the hands of a foreign competitor. The question of how many more such pipelines remain undiscovered is one the investigators are not yet prepared to answer. Subscribe to FBI Secret for more cinematic reconstructions of the federal operations that shape our world. FBI raids hospital CEO's $42 million estate. She sold 38 million patient records to China. == title _end == March 24th, 2026, 6:15 a.m. 17 unmarked federal vehicles converge on a Napa Valley estate as FBI San Francisco, HHS-OIG, and OFAC execute Operation Jade Conduit, the largest healthcare data theft prosecution in American history. Pacific Crest Healthcare CEO Dr. Margaret Holdsworth moved $2.1 billion through a Bermuda shell company over 7 years, selling 38 million re-identifiable patient records to a Chinese pharmaceutical conglomerate that used the data to undercut U.S. drugs across 12 therapeutic categories. A Mayo Clinic graduate student noticed a statistical impossibility inside a patent filing. 14 months later, 14 hospitals across 3 states went dark at the same minute. This is how federal investigators built the case. Jade Conduit breached == intro _end == ALT1 aggressive storm/raid. 17 FBI vehicles storm Napa Estate at 6:15 a.m. Hospital CEO sold 38M patients to China. ALT2. Informative. How a Mayo grad student exposed a $2.10 billion hospital data conspiracy with China. ALT3. Victim/scale. 38 million American patients sold to a Chinese pharma giant inside the FBI raid. ALT4. With series tag. The hospital CEO who sold America's medical records to China. Vertical bar FBI files. == additional _end == pre-dawn Napa Valley estate. Fog still on the vineyards. In the foreground, a stern silver-haired woman in a cream silk robe, Dr. Holdsworth, standing in a marble foyer with hands folded, expression frozen. Behind her, 3 FBI agents in raid vests with FBI letters glowing, weapons low ready, flashlights cutting through mist. Through the open mansion door, red and blue strobe light bleeding across cypress trees, silhouettes of unmarked Suburbans. Bottom left overlay, a wireframe globe showing a red data stream arcing from California to Hangzhou. Top right corner, bold blood red text, 38 million patients, with broken padlock icon, color palette, cold blue pre-dawn, accent red strobes, gold light spilling from inside the estate, cinematic anamorphic lens flare. Mood, institutional menace meets quiet collapse. Colava,